My name is Bernhard Schroeder. I'm a director at the Lab and Entrepreneurship Center, and I also teach several courses in the Fowler College of Business. The session we have today is, when we were asked to put a session together, it was around creativity and innovation. And we all teach and dabble in that space, but as we looked at, what could we share with other people around creativity and innovation? In other words, helping your students be more creative and innovative on purpose. We kind of all agreed very quickly that we think the problem with that is the problems that our students are trying to solve, right? And so welcome to the session. I want to introduce Alex Bruton and Jeffrey Stamp. Alex is a professor of entrepreneurship and engineering at the University of Calgary, we say in Canada. He's an interesting anomaly. He's got an MBA and then he followed it up with a PhD in engineering. So he's like a business nerd. The thing that I like about Alex is he also heads Innographer, which is kind of an innovation consultancy and education firm where he really tries to teach people how to find and cultivate problems that are actually worth solving. Jeffrey Stamp is a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at the University of Minnesota, where he got his PhD. And early in his career, he did cut his teeth at General Mills and Frito-Lay, where he solved some problems in the retail space. He's also the founder of Bold Thinking, another consultancy that's focused on helping others innovate ideas and may perhaps bring them to life through some entrepreneurial experiments and education. What the format will be, we all three of us agreed we want to share things with people that they could use every day. So the format will be Alex and Jeff presenting insights into what you could hopefully build into a course, whether it's a fundamentals course, could be a creativity course, it could be a business model course. Our goal is to help your students get better at finding and solving real problems. And so the session we'll look at what we can give you in terms of frameworks and research methodologies and tools around finding and solving problems in a better way. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alex. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. And like you said, I think we've agreed the focus should be on practical stuff. That's what we're going to try and do here. And I'll give you a context. I used to teach in a business school for about 7 years and now teach in an engineering school. And there's a big difference. And the stereotype is somewhat true in that my engineering students are incredibly good at solutions. If you want someone to implement it right, they can do it. But they're not as good at figuring out what the right it is to implement. And that relates to this idea of problems. So I'm going to share my screen here and just give you a bit of a tour of a couple of tools. So my hope is that we hit on, and please tell me if you can't see this, but I want to hit on a few things that you can take away. That's my goal. So when I work with those students or when I coach entrepreneurs or corporate context, trying to make their ideas better, what we want are good ideas. We want those ideas that when we hear them, our eyes light up, or the people who are giving them guidance lights up, or the lawyers who are giving them advice, or the funders who are going to fund them, that their eyes light up. And that's a very intangible kind of thing. So what we try to do is make it a little more tangible and say, and I'll say for the sake of discussion today, we want ideas that are at the same time highly impactful and imminently feasible for that team to carry out. And we call those really big value ideas like this. And what we really want actually is to see our students do what we call quick strategic pivoting to this place of big ideas. So I want to lay on the table today, put on the table a couple of tools that I use to help those students I've described to you do that. And what we tend to get, despite what we want, what we tend to get are a whole bunch of, in my case, I use this thing called an idea napkin at the very early or pretty early stages. And I get a bunch of those. And I get a bunch of this, which is my idea model. And then we roll into business models and we roll into business plans, all of these being prototypes of opportunities in various levels of complexity and stages of development, but they tend not to be in that top right corner. of this chart that I was showing you before. They tend to instead be in the bottom right corner, or perhaps over here in the top left corner. And it's a struggle to get people with any one of those prototypes, the opportunity on the screen here, into that top right corner, no matter where they are in their development process. So we want those. What can we do? And like I said, a couple of tools put on the table here to try and share with you what I do with people. So when the problem is the problem, there are lots of problems, but sometimes, and I'm picking on my engineering students a bit here, the problem is that they don't have the right problem, or they don't know how to analyze a problem, and as I'll show you in a minute, they don't know how to look at the same time for problem, solution, and customer, that triad at the same time, because their focus is tending to be so much on solution. There's a website there, I'll just throw it in here for those looking at the recording. You can get all this kind of stuff, and there's free access to it right now as well.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah, go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting. Could you speak a little bit louder?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to. Yeah, thanks for telling me. So like I said, you can pull it from, I'm pulling from this tool set that's found online, and you can get access to that. So I'm going to break it down by looking at our idea model here, and the pieces that you see in the middle of that chart. And they look like this, that an idea is made up of these elements at its core. Who are you, the people on the team? What are you offering down here with the offering? Who are you offering it to as the customer? Why do they care as a value proposition? Does your venture have any distinctive competencies? And what are the substitutes and alternatives? So when you drill into that, most want to focus here. And I was picking on my engineering students, but we all want to focus on the offering, on our solution. Whereas, and few get to here, they don't really get to know the customer. And where I'm trying to drive to today is that the magic happens here at the intersection of these, this space, the value proposition, or where the problem is. So the first tool is getting to volume. And I want to just put on the table, and again, these are real quick to keep to the time I have and just introduce you and start the conversation. But this notion of personal idea storming. So this is an individual exercise where I'm trying to get people to volume. Get people to more ideas, the discipline of idea storming. And it's as simple as this. Don't come back in here until you've got a bunch of ideas written down. And that sounds silly and unsupported, but at first we let it be completely unsupported. And they look at me and go, you want me to fill in all of those for a potential idea? And I say, yes. So that's the first thing, is just this idea of being fluent, of being able to get ideas down, get to volume, have lots of ideas. And at the moment, I'm loose with it. I'm just calling them ideas. I'm nowhere near where we need to get on problem. So the second tool, though, and again, just to do these quickly, is called the PCS, or Problem Customer Solution Triad, where after doing some of this for a while, we try to get them to look at an idea as a combination of a problem, a customer, and a solution. So I'll get them to repeat their idea storming with that little bit of structure. So each of those ideas then becomes, instead of just a thing on a Post-it note, it's a problem and a customer and a solution. And for many people, this is the first time they've actually thought of it, an idea as having that kind of basic structure with problem, customer, beneficiary, and solution. And of course, then what you can do is say, okay, now go do that whole exercise, focusing just on the different problems you might be able to address with your potential solution or with that customer you have in mind. So I want you to hold customer and solution constant and just do a bunch of idea storming on problem. And all we really do here, as it says on the top right, is put the focus on the problem a little bit. Just get them to think about the problem, to idea storm the problem a little bit. And even that can open the eyes of people where you don't allow their focus to be on the solution. And then the third tool is this thing called the value proposition wheel, where we're trying to get then to testing for a real problem. Because it's all good to think you've got a problem and to idea storm this problem within a triad of customer solution problem. But how do we get beyond that? So this is really about trusting yourself and not fooling yourself as you design value, as you get out there, as you try and make this thing real. And so I come back to this piece here where we're at the intersection of the offering, where we like to spend our time, and the customer, who we often tend to think about in abstract ways. And that intersection is this value proposition, which becomes a testable hypothesis. And so the wheel is simply an organizational tool where we put our pre-personas on the wheel. And so we might have a pre-persona. Somebody, by the way, the word pre means untested, hypothesized. Second pre-persona, third, fourth pre-persona, and so on. And then we look at who those people are. Why does each care? What are the things that, and this is where the problem starts to bubble up. And what barriers might there be to them adopting? And then we go over to, again, really quick, just introduction. I ask them to look at, for each pre-persona, are you a candy, a vitamin, or a painkiller? And then, oops, are you a big gain maker? And are you enduringly essential? And so we've got these 3 tests of the value proposition, or tests of that intersection where the problem lies for each of the stakeholders, of the hypothesized stakeholders. And we ask these 3 tests, and I'll just do this playfully for a minute, just to give you a teaser of what I share with my students. I'll say to them, you know, here are those tests, and you don't have to be all of these things for all of your pre-personas. So if you're looking, I teach them briefly about candy versus vitamin versus painkiller, and I know you know all this already, and we talk about what those are, and I give them examples of those, and I try to emphasize you don't need to be a painkiller for everybody on that value proposition wheel in your value landscape, just for some of those, and perhaps not always for some, but you should be striving for that. We talk about big gain maker and the test of whether anybody in any of those pre-personas and that is saying this because they see it solving a problem so strongly for them. And then we talk about whether they're, you know, that pre-persona, whether you're going to be enduring and essential for that pre-persona. So are you like a garbage person in New York City when they go on strike, where everybody demands it back? Will you be that in the future? And so the 4th tool, and I'll leave you with this one before I hand it over, is trying to break it and better it, and what I call the 5 humans test. So we want to get to breaking those assumptions that we've captured so far, and the mindset of not trying to persuade people you're right, but learn where you're wrong. And so you rarely get answers that are good if you ask those questions. You can't walk up to a potential customer and say, am I a painkiller, or am I enduring and essential for you? It just doesn't work. So instead what we do is, in fact, frankly, we don't even get good answers if we ask people what they think of our idea. So instead we ask them to find 5 people who represent each of those assumed hypothesized pre-personas and ask them to help you break it and better it. And there's a lot more under the hood than what's here, but it's basically that. What's wrong with this, and how could I make it better? And we do that for each pre-persona, and this is where that 5-person rule comes in. I tell them, don't come back in here until you've met 5 people who represent that. Don't go do surveys, don't go do forums yet, focus groups or anything like that. Don't commission marketing research. Go meet 5 humans who you know their first name, and test your value proposition, test your problem with this simple break it and better it approach before you commit any resources or any time to marketing research or otherwise. And then ask yourselves as you come back on a team, because I'll tell everybody on the team, I want every one of you to find 5 people who represent and come back in here with 5 people representing each pre-persona. Then they know when they walk back in the room whether they have, whether these value proposition tests pass, and they've got a lot of insights to what the problems are and just as importantly, what those problems aren't. Then you can add back a little structure. You can do a lot with just the back of a napkin and get to those strategic pivots and find the right idea. And then you set them loose on more structure, developing what they need to do and going deeper. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen. Oops.
No, hang on just for a second, and then we'll bring Jeffrey in. Alex, we have a good question from someone.
Okay.
And the question is, when you're teaching this, are you teaching this in the business school or the engineering school?
I've done both.
Okay.
And do it in very similar ways.
So as you're getting through your syllabus of what you're trying to teach, on average, how long do you find that it takes for you to repeat this with the students until they get it?
Yeah. So this stuff I've shown you today most of it falls under something called basic training. And the students go through basic training for about, and I have a luxury in the course I'm describing to you of being able to spend about 5 classes on this, 5 sessions of about an hour and 15 minutes, where I'm telling them you're building your tool belt, and we do it with throwaway ideas, and we do it with exercises they bring in, and we workshop in the room. And then I do something called the Venture Design Studio, where it starts to get real. They have to design a high impact, high feasibility idea, but constantly through that, we're pulling back into it these pre-ideation fundamentals that we're talking about here, this ability to find the problem, and we're pushing them on the value prop tests, and we're pushing them on getting out there to break it better, and we're pushing them right back to the basics of, you need to do some idea storming on different problems you could be solving here, because I don't think you've got one. So it's something, I guess my answer was, we do a focus piece, and then we pull it back all the time. We pull it back all the time and reinforce. And frankly, they can't succeed in the broader challenges of the course without mastering some of this stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
With that, I'd like to, you unshare your screen, and I'd like to invite Jeffrey Stamp to walk into his presentation.
Well, awesome. Here, I'll share my screen, and I think you can see it now, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, welcome everyone, and I am so glad to be a part of this conference, and I always enjoy the heck out of getting a chance to work with Alex, because generally, Alex, we tend to go the other direction, right? We kind of bookend each other, because I'm glad to be following Alex today, because I'm hoping as you looked at his slides, there was one slide that I want you to recall back in your memory, and that was very early on, and that was the page of all the sticky notes, step one. And that's the world that I live in. I call it the yellow sticky brick road, because students often give you that glazed eyed look, like, and Alex said it perfectly. He goes, students look at you and they say, you expect me to fill all those up? And I like the question that came in on the chat window about the difference between an idea and a problem. So this is the space I'd like to talk a little bit about. This is the world that I live in as both a professional creative on one side of my life, and then also as a professor on the other side of my life, because my research is about where do ideas come from? How do people get ideas and what they do? Now, I'm in the Department of Applied Economics. I'm like Alex, I live in sort of an interesting world where I'm not actually in the business school. The Department of Applied Economics is actually in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Scientists. Natural Resource Sciences, which is an applied college of what do you do with all the things that scientists work on. And so it's a really interesting place, because I work on how ideas become assets, but I work specifically way upstream in what are the ideas. And most of the time, the challenge really boils down to is, why do we create? Now, I'm going to differentiate between creativity, because it's the tool. What I'm looking for is the output. Something that's creative is both novel and has utility. But I start from a very interesting position, and that is I've now had a chance and a blessing to speak in 33 different countries on creativity. And I've yet to find a group of people anywhere in the world that can't kill a good idea. Killing ideas seems to be a highly honed human talent. And we tend to live in a world where the negative frame tends to dominate the positive frame. And so negativity is actually a very useful component to ideas. But I would like to explore one very simple method that we use to help students fill that page of yellow sticky notes. I want to stay specifically in that lane, because then it supports everything that Alex talks about when you go forward, because you have to have something from which to work with. Now, the thing that I always ask students, no matter where I go, is I say, what do you hope to do when you're done with school? What do you hope to accomplish in your career? And usually the answer is some form of the phrase, make the world a better place. And then I simply ask the question, well, define better. You see, they're more worried about the making. They want to figure out how to make something. That is interesting, but what really is the question is, what is better? And when I ask them to define better, that's where the conversation generally stops. Now, there's a lot of folks out there that think that creativity and brainstorming, the concept of brainstorming, and Alec talks about idea storming, that process is dead, that brainstorming no longer is relevant. Well, the fact of the matter, the human brain, the cognition of your creativity hasn't changed at all. It's just simply the way in which we process it. So if you think about back when Alex Osborne and others and James Webb Young, when they created the concept of how do you ideate and how do you brainstorm, it was because in those days, we had a very information sparse environment. People just didn't have access to subject matter experts. And so brainstorming functioned as an information network, or the beginnings of a knowledge network. You brought a bunch of very smart people together in a room, and sometimes you had customer people, and you had logistics people, and you had product development people, and you had all kinds of different talents, but you use that as a way to sort of have a distributed innovation process of people who work together to come up with ideas. And it worked very well in its time, but now we have a very information-rich environment. And so everything becomes Google, right? The Google has opened the world to us, and everything you can find on the internet becomes great fodder. And yet I find that this is not, and again, I see some of the biggest limitations is we always think it's about the youth or the millennials. Stop thinking that direction, because it's really just a human experience perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what gets in the way. but it really is an information or knowledge flow challenge. And so the way in which people process information has changed. And so we need to change and find different ways to get these ideas out of their heads. In our research, we've done a lot of work on just ideation sessions, and we find that 50% of the participants don't say all the ideas that come to their mind. And I'm sure, Bern and Alex, you've seen many students after you start to talk to them about their ideas, they go, well, I thought about that, but I just didn't want to say anything. And so the concept of where the ideas start and how the ideas form generally tend to do with what we see depends mainly on what we're looking for. And so the concept of ideation, or where ideas start in order to determine whether they're the right problem, is simply a matter of perspective and, interestingly, on focus. It's about knowing what to look at. Now, I know a lot of professors love to use this very simple tool called a bug report. Walk around and look at what bugs you and then just fix it. Now, that's an interesting frame because it usually is about the things I don't like, and then I turn that into the things that solve the problem for something that I do like. But that is really in the domain of just the things that I can reach out and just touch in front of me. And for most students, that world of what they can touch isn't very far. So part of what we need to do is to really challenge the way we look at problem solving. Mostly in education, we take a problem, we have two kinds of problems, a well-defined problem or an ill-defined problem. Now, well-defined problems are very simple. 2 + 2 is 4. It's a convergent thinking method, or if I were to say, what's the capital of California? This is where the California Educators Conference is. We maybe should ask the question, what's the capital of California? In that case, there is an answer. It is the high probability outcome answer, and it's what we're looking for. But in the world of the creative or the entrepreneur or the disruptor or the person who's looking at something that bugs them and looking for something better, these are ill-defined problems. So we need more divergent thinking methods that allow for students to create multiple answers by which, and Alex uses the same word I love to use, we have to hypothesize, right? A standard process for determining what is the best answer. Now, the word best answer also is very subjective because maybe that answer just needs to be sufficient to get to the next step of the journey in whether we're doing customer discovery or product discovery or market discovery. So before we get too far down the way, we just have to figure out how to build all those yellow sticky notes. So a couple of things that I love to do in the classroom, I don't care whether they're freshmen, I've done this with high school students. As a matter of fact, my favorite group of creatives, tweens. Now, we define a tween as someone who's between 10 and 12 before they become a teenager. These individuals are amazingly creative and come up with all kinds of great ideas. I think all entrepreneurship students should find their little cousins, somebody between 10 and 12 years old, and use them to crowdsource ideas. Because that's when the mind has very little limitations of what can't be done, and yet not enough experience in the world to be shut down by this is the way it's always been done. So what we have to do is we have to get their cognition more fluid. Alex mentioned that too. How do you fill up all those pages? And part of it is just simply trying to figure out how to answer a question. And part of working with ill-defined problems is a contextualization process. And a context, and it's very important that in the entrepreneurial context or the creatives context, as a matter of fact, we always talk about entrepreneurship as the process of creating value. We tend to think that creativity is a subsection of entrepreneurship. As a creative, I tend to think that entrepreneurship actually is a subset of creativity. It just simply is creativity in an economic space. So context is, the context of the problem is really the centerpiece of this meal that we have. And in this relationship, it's about a formal or informal setting in which an action occurs. And this is the big aha for most students. It's not necessarily the what, it's the action that has the difference between cause and effect. And most individuals, and whether I've worked with corporate executives or corporate research teams and college students, it's literally remembering that everything has a cause and an effect. And so how do we use that and practice it? Here's one of my favorite examples. I love to use this, and you can use this in your class at any time. And we could crowdsource the answers here, but in the chat window, but everyone will see this answer differently. If I were to ask, How is a team like this chair? Now, I love when I work with groups of people in a brainstorming or an idea storming session. There'll be those people that want to turn an ill-defined problem into a defined problem. Well, the answer is obvious, Jeff. There are 4 legs on that chair, and everybody needs to be supported on a team. Okay, that's an answer. It's not necessarily the answer. And so students first have to look at a forced analogy and be able to recognize that there are many different answers to this problem. And you just have to start to peel apart the assets of the chair. A chair has wheels. A team needs to be flexible and move around and be able to pivot and change or turn. And people go, oh, now I see what you mean. Because our natural inclination from our education is to turn all problems into defined problems and look for the answer. And we have to let that go. So what we typically do then from this part, after we've gotten them to see a basic notion of what is an ill-defined problem and what is possible, is they have to now to start to perceive the world in a different way. So we do an exercise on perspective and context. Now, I'll tell you, it isn't that hard. I literally, for my students, or class usually between 45 and 50, they come into the class and I'll give them one question for the entire semester, and everybody has to create an idea for a business off of one question. And I'll show you an example from last semester, and you'll be quite surprised that there can be 40 different ideas from one question. And yet all the students from all their different majors bring their experiences and their perspectives, but it's about better ways to search. And here's what I'll do. I'll go, here's a picture of our campus. What do you see here? Well, you see a building. You see students sitting in the yard. You see greenery. You see plants. And I'll get students that'll go, I got an idea. We need to have an app for how can we schedule green space on campus so that classes can be outside when it's a perfect day, and it ties in weather information. And you know, the next thing they're doing is they're looking at this picture and trying to take this ill-defined world and try to make it a defined problem solution, and they're done. Because that's the way we learn to answer problems. But the question really boils down to, is that all you see? So I make them actually go out in that space, take pictures, bring them back to class and say, what else do we see? Now, because I'm in the department or in the College of Food and Agriculture and Natural Resource Sciences, there'll be plant students, horticulture students, and they'll go, we need to have more sustainable plants. And they'll look at the problems through the lens of their experience. And yet, as we go through the different pictures of the same view in the same place, the students start to realize, well, we also have seasons on campus, and they'll look at things to do with nature and everything else. And then I'll go, we're missing the common piece between all these elements. And what would that be? I go, what is common between all these pictures? And so I literally ask a very simple question. How much cement is in a sidewalk? And they literally have that aha moment because they've never answered that question. Now, I know you're thinking, but what if I have a writing student or a music student or a business student? They know nothing about cement. See, it's not about answering the question in a defined, how much cement. The question is, what is cement and what does this have to do with this picture? Because all I'm saying is in that square at the bottom, how much cement is in that main mall? Just how much is there? And they look at me like, why do I need to know that? Because it starts opening the sense of possibility. Where can we walk and what can we do? So I asked them to really study the concept of effect and effect. What are the things that they can look at and they can process through this? So what we do is a very simple question. We basically make a very simple question. How many cubic feet of cement are in the sidewalks on campus? And now they have to actually go do some research. And no matter what their major is, there is an answer. If I have one piece of a sidewalk, how thick is it? How are its dimensions? How do I actually size what is the cement? Now, I know you're thinking, that sounds very technical. You're going to be surprised of the answers of the business that come out of this are very and very wide. So the big thing is they have to start asking questions. So in other words, in order to find a good problem, you have to start with better questions. So we do what we call a context walk. It's a type of a brainstorming map. People are used to doing brainstorming maps, but they're just simply ideas that are just put on a piece of paper. What I really want them to do is to do cause and effect. Look at the action which draws one element to the other. And so it really boils down to everything that you look at, every question has inputs and every question has outputs. And so they start with, how is cement made? And they have to go on Google and they have to do some research and they have to figure out, well, how do you size a sidewalk? How much does sidewalk cost? It's $35 a cubic foot. Oh my goodness, that's a lot. Is that a lot? And they start to ask questions. They get an entire week to break this down into some very big pieces. And so then they start to ask other kinds of effect questions like, well, if I make cement, does it have an effect on greenhouse gas? And now all of their normal knowledge starts to show up in very different ways. Can I make a low carbon dioxide sidewalk alternative? Do we have to have cement? And then what happens is all these ideas start to percolate up and they start to ask even social entrepreneurship questions like, well, do sidewalks pose mobility constraints? And as long as everything is written in a question, it can have a hypothesis. And now you can start to talk about, is there a customer? Is there an actual element of this that we can work on? Then they'll ask other questions like, well, we do have seasons here. Does winter shorten the lifespan of a sidewalk? What is the effect of salt on the sidewalk? Wait a minute, what's the effect of salt on the grass? What's the effect of all this water in our sewer system? And the next thing you know, they start to develop this very simple question and they bring it to class, and with 40 students, we'll have almost 200 to 300 different connections of things that they think about. And they think about things that have nothing to do with cement. For example, one of the questions that came up with, do cell phones make sidewalks more dangerous? In other words, I'm looking at my phone, am I paying attention to where everybody else is going? And you can start to see that the next thing you know, they'll go, well, we need to have drones, or we need to have sensors, and all these other things that have to do with trends and what's common and what's hot, and what they're thinking about has a focus, because what we did is we turned it into a question that went from what is the effect, what is the effect, and how do we play that through? One of the things that I thought was really kind of hilarious about it is the best idea that came out of the class, what I thought was interesting, was one student who was a veterinary student. Well, cement is hard on a horse's hooves. And we're all looking at him like, well, tell us about this. And after he started talking about it, another student went, well, maybe we should put shoes on the horse. And the person goes, of course, you always put shoes on the horse. And then the other person went, but could you make 3D printed horseshoes? And that became an idea for an actual business. So the very interesting part about this, and I'll leave it with a couple of very interesting, some very interesting tidbits that you can try, is just simply ask better questions. One of the easiest areas to always work with is food. Take from whatever country your students are from and say, what is a food that's popular? How can I change it? One of my students was from Norway, and she said, why don't we make a handheld waffle? And the next thing you know, it became a business. Take any food and make it something that's different. Most of my students are completely amazed that one of my favorite ethnic foods from Austria is Red Bull. And they just look at you because they just don't have that perspective. And so every semester, I'll give them one picture and one question. What is a controller? That took us for an entire semester. Or what is a light bulb? What is light? Or what is to be enlightened? Next semester, because of COVID, I'm going to give them this, a door handle. And what is a door handle, and what can we learn, and what can we share and bring from that? So in many ways, how do you fill the bucket? Well, the bucket gets filled and the Post-it notes get filled by simply asking better questions. And so that's the way I like to try to start with, how do we get to that place? And how do you get them to broaden their horizon? Because then all the rest of the process is, what do you find a passion about? What do you care about? And what are you interested in? And I've been surprised that simply one picture can mean a whole semester's worth of work, and it isn't really that hard to just get them all turned on.
Jeffrey, I'm exhausted. You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, because I shock the students on the very first day of class. Not shock them in a sense of sending them off into a tizzy, but when I come into class, because I don't know what my final roster is going to be, and I don't know who's crashing and who's coming in, and they don't understand what the class is about. I'm telling you right now, my class is titled Creativity and Innovation. And when I ask students, what do you think you're going to get from this class? I don't know if they actually know. Sounds cool, sounds interesting. I hope it's not tough. And so what I do on the very first night, I walk in and I'm wearing an old school conference badge in a little plastic holder. And they're not even paying attention to it. And 15, 20 minutes into the class, I take the badge off and I put it on the desk. And I say, my badge is no longer functioning for me. I need a new badge. And they have no context. I haven't gone through the syllabus. I haven't done anything. And I say, you have 25 minutes, get into Teams. I want you to use this framework. I want you to identify a problem I might be having with the badge. I want you to ideate. You cannot turn your drawing in unless you have 20 possible ideas. And then I want you to design a next generation badge for me. And I want you to draw it and I want you to present it to me. And I think, what I said, the message I'm sending on the very first day is this is not a normal class. I'm going to ask you to think in the first 15 to 20 minutes. And then I accelerate this through the semester to the point where last week I asked them to evaluate the problem with GoPro. And that's the only direction I gave them. And I did not ask them for a solution. I said, I need you to help me and the board at GoPro understand why this company is failing. So now you have 40 minutes, work for 10 minutes doing research on GoPro in case you don't know them, then spend the next 10 minutes agreeing on what the problem might be. And then refine that problem, and eventually the only thing you're going to present is the problem. I don't want a solution. My question is, and I think I'll put this one up to Alex. We have someone who asked the question, how do you, wake up the creativity and the imagination of students to put them into the mindset, Alex, of purposely trying to be more creative in a classroom setting?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few things that come to mind. One of them is making it a discipline, giving it time and space. It's a real thing. It's a real thing that we have to build a personal discipline in. And at some point they look at me and say, okay, so we've been doing this for, like I said, we have basic training for 5 or 6 sessions. And those midway through who are struggling to figure out what the learning goals are, we come back to them. And I say, no, this is just as much a personal discipline that you can get good at. You can build the muscle at as building, pro forma financial statements or whatever other kind of tangible learning you're used to doing. And so there's the holding it up as a discipline. The other one is building assessment that matches, because if this is in a course context, human nature is such that if you don't have the assessment in place to match it, and it's not well aligned, and it isn't rewarded or it isn't recognized, then it falls down. So you have to find ways of making it so, like I said earlier, they can't escape the assessment. They can't get the mark they want or the outcome they want without mastering or at least reaching a level of competency in some of these elements. So it becomes part of the bigger teaching and learning environment, I guess, is the way I'd put it.
Let me ask you a question, Jeffrey. How do you make it safe in your classroom, Jeff?
Yeah.
For people to engage?
Yeah, and I'll add to Alex's part, Alex, what you say is the students do that naturally. They'll say, well, I don't understand what our learning outcome is. And they're trying to take that ill-defined exercise and make it a defined outcome because that's where their security is, right? And that's part of their safety is they need to know that when they create that it's safe. And I tell them I love Alex's PSC, triad, because in many ways what you're doing is you're establishing what is valuable. And so the first thing I do is I ask them, you define what's valuable. Now you have to be careful because students will come up with very edgy ideas that almost go on the edge of both practicality, but also political correctness or politeness. And sometimes they'll see an idea that can be a little off-putting to some of the students in the class. And I let them pitch, and we tell students, this is a safe environment to experiment. That's why you're in college. You need to have the freedom to experiment. But as you get the feedback by the looks of the people on the face who they just went, you just said what? Like, for example, do sidewalks inhibit mobility? And then there was this question of, well, what is mobility and how do we deal with it and how do we be sensitive to it? And people were literally taking sides. And I tell them, look, if we can't decide what is valuable as a culture, that's the end litmus test. It has to be novel and utility, but it has to be agreed upon by the societal group that it does have value. And I make them, Alex, actually define their value and then pitch it. That way they go, I now see where there's flaws in my value model. I need to do something else. But you do have to remind people that if it is if you in your mind think this is something that's okay to say to a customer, go test it. And I let them learn sometime. I try to make sure they're not going to do a hard fall, but at some point they need to be able to test and learn as they grow what is valuable and what is appropriate within that value space.
Okay, I want to do something kind of interesting in the next 3 minutes before we move to a close. I want to rapid fire some questions at you, and I want you to come back with only 10 to 15-second answers, okay?
Yep.
All right, now I'll let either one of you go, depending on who you think can handle it. First question, how do we use evaluation and assessment in a creativity course to know the students are learning what they're supposed to be learning?
All right, I'll jump on that. I hope you can see this picture.
Mm-hmm.
I've got 3 levels of assessment: learning about from your desk, being on the dance floor, what it's like to do it, and then being on the balcony, or what it's like to learn it. So if you can express what we're trying to get out of it at all 3 of these levels to students, I find that the response can be quite strong, because some of them are looking for this, some of them are looking to be able to do it. Some are looking to learn about it, some are looking to do it, and some are looking to lead it. And I find just that simple structure and framing that out at the beginning and end of every day can make a difference.
Okay.
What I do is I make them do a hypothesis journal, and as long as they can ask hypothesis questions about what they're thinking about and they can frame it, I think that they have a good understanding of where they are at. And I think they see their own deficits at times from that exercise.
Okay. And I'll throw in, for someone who's being quite literal, I use 10 assignments in my class that are a range of individual and group. They're based on using cases, readings, and several other tools that I use. My syllabus, I'll make it available inside Whova so that you can see what I'm actually doing in the syllabus and what I'm requiring the students to do. Because, you know, one of the things I don't do is I don't do multiple choice tests in a creativity and innovation course. And so I have to have a lot of measurements and inputs in order to know whether or not they're learning what they're learning. Next question. Can you use both convergent and divergent thinking to solve a problem?
Absolutely. It's iterative. I let them start by diverging, but then they have to pick one of the boxes on the map, and they have to then converge and really break it down into where the problem solution and value pieces go, and then identify a customer. You know, on my midterm point, Bern, you say no multiple choice. What I make them do is, here's 3 ideas that we came up with, pick the best one, and then you got to define what that means. And so it really is about making decisions, because at the end of the day, that's what every entrepreneur has to do.
It's funny because we're obviously linked inside the business school, and I have a cross section of students in my class, not only from all over the campus, but also from the business school. And when I ask them to rate where problem solving is in the scheme of the success of their career, it's shocking to me how low sometimes they rate the ability to solve problems in their career. And then I say to them, and they learn it through the semester, it probably will be the #1 asset that you have. If you can be skill-based, but if you don't know how to solve problems and lead teams, you have a problem. What I'd like to do now is move to a 2-minute close. We have about 4.5 minutes left. Go to a 2-minute close from each of you of what you'd like to leave the attendees with. I'll have you go first, Alex.
Sure. I think I wrote it somewhere in the chat window, I believe, or perhaps drafted it. The big takeaway is you can put people's focus on the problem, but bigger than that, I guess I'll do it by contrasting brainstorming to idea storming in a stereotypical way. Brainstorming is where you've got one person leading a group, and you've got a problem in mind, and you're trying to find solutions. You're firing away at trying to find solutions. Idea storming often can be done individually first, and then in a group later. But the power of individual first is that you can be looking for problem, solution, and customer all at the same time. And that leads us to this notion, this individual then group, to what we just touched on, which is going through a divergent period first, then an emergent period where ideas emerge and get shared and mixed, and then a convergence period, and then a cycling back on that same thing. So that's sort of a broader context for some of the tools that we've seen here. And I think I'll just leave the thought that it's obvious, I think, that we think this by the nature of this topic or this session, but it is so important that you can shift people's focus around from those different elements to each other at different times, even when they're deep into what they're trying to do and they're deep into their venture. Right? You can pull someone back from, a year and a half into a new venture development project, right back to the back of the napkin or to the Post-it notes or to the PCS structure and make great breakthroughs.
Great. Jeffrey?
Yeah,
Jeffrey, do you think you can close in 2.5 minutes?
Oh, I can, absolutely. Because I'll go with the piece that goes, but I'm sitting between the two of you and the pictures, and I use it as my reference because we all know that too many students, as well as professionals, love to use hope as a process for entrepreneurship. And hope is not a strategy because you can't transact it. It's hard to transact hope. And so I like to teach my students about tactical hope. It's instead, one of the guards against magical thinking is to not just have abstract magic, it's got to be tactical. It has to do something. And often we miss in creativity that it's not only just novel, but it has to have utility. And so I ask the students all the time, let your mind relax, find and ask better questions, learn to reflect on those questions and look at a customer and look at a market. But always remember, it has to be tactical. If you can't turn a transaction, an idea can't become an asset. So we always remember ideas have to become assets at some point, but they have to have a sense of hope to get up every day and keep going. So that's the way I look at it, tactical hope.
Great. I'd like to thank all the panelists. Alex, we've done things individually where we've had you both at the campus at different times, but the three of us, have never managed to kind of be together. I feel like we're three musketeers in our belief of what we're teaching, because we don't want to just teach generic creativity and innovation stuff. We actually want to give students skills and knowledge that when they leave, they can apply some of these things as they move into their career. And at least that's my hope. I tell students, when they're using a tool in the class, whether it's Mind Map or Blue Ocean Strategy, and I give them a specific tool to solve a specific problem. I go, someday when your manager says we have this problem and you pull out a Mind Map tool to lead a meeting or Blue Ocean Strategy, they're going to say, where did you go to school? This is something the McKinsey people use. And so I'm real cognizant that I have to take the students from almost a nascent infant level, make them feel like they're 10 again, Jeffrey, which I try to do on purpose in my class, create a very safe environment. We don't judge a single idea. We allow them to present. We never vote on what they present. And by the time they hit the 7th or 8th week, they feel like they can unleash in the classroom. And when you've got 40 or 50 students that can feel they're unleashing in the classroom, everything just starts to move. And they're working and doing things that I don't think if you told them or showed them the syllabus at the beginning of the year, they'd be like, we're not going to do that. And so I'd like to thank both of you for sharing your insights, for making some of your resources available. We're getting a lot of requests for links and slides. So I really honestly appreciate you guys being here today.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Keeping us on the straight. It was great. Good facilitation.
Yeah, heard 3 creatives. That's got to be a new record. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't break Zoom. All right. With that, to the attendees, there's going to be another session, obviously, in about 10 minutes. Please go back into your Whova app, check which session is next and where you'd like to go. And then once again, when we decided to put the conference on, we had no idea that so many people from around the world would be coming in. And it's not about us. It's about the people coming in from around the world, and that hopefully all of us can share some information and allow us all to be better at what we do. So thank you all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Thank you.
All right.
Good to see you, Alex.
You
Bern.
too. Bye, everyone.